Theo Wilson didn't plan to change anyone's life that evening. In fact, when he scribbled the name Amelia Taylor on the final line of the guest registry, he did it with the same careless arrogance he used for everything in his father's house. His friends were crowded in the game lounge upstairs, laughing as they passed around bottles and bragged about who would make the best entrance at the upcoming event. The annual Wilson Systems Innovation Unveil, a private showcase where the wealthiest families came to flaunt their influence under the disguise of tech progress. It wasn't a gala. It wasn't a charity dinner. It was a night where people pretended to care about new security drones and data vaults, when all they truly cared about was seeing who arrived with who wore what, and who owned the newest imported vehicle. Hi family, do you know getting a script and images, even having to work on voiceovers can be so draining? And that's why I need you to subscribe to my channel to give me the push I need to keep going. It's sincerely not easy, but I am sure your subscription and watch will help me keep going. Thank you so much. Let us continue. Theo, just bring someone random. Nicholas laughed from the sofa. Or better still, bring your housemaid. What's her name again? The quiet one. Amelia. Isla, one of the few girls who floated around Theo's circle, snorted into her drink. Imagine her showing up there. Those people would choke. The laughter was instant, loud, the kind that encouraged stupidity. And in the middle of it, Theo grinned, that half smirk he wore when he was about to do something thoughtless. Should I actually do it? You won't, Adam challenged. You don't have the balls. Theo grabbed the clipboard on the glass table and clicked a pen with sharp confidence. Watch me. And without a moment of hesitation, he wrote it, Amelia Taylor, guest of Theo Wilson. It was supposed to be a joke, a story for the group chat, something to make the night less boring. He didn't think about how Amelia might feel. He didn't think about the fact that she wasn't just a maid. She was a girl who woke up before dawn, kept the entire house running, never complained, never argued, and never asked for anything in return. A girl who worked silently around their chaos, like she had learned to fold herself into the corners of every room. He didn't think of her at all. Not until the night came. Not until he saw her. But that moment was far away. For now, Theo tossed the clipboard back on the table, satisfied with himself, as his friends erupted into more laughter. Downstairs, Amelia was polishing the marble counter when she overheard them. She didn't catch every word, but she heard her name, and she heard the tone. The mocking, careless tone that always came when wealthy people forgot that maids had ears, eyes, and hearts. She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the cleaning cloth. Amelia had been in that house long enough to know when she was being laughed at, but she kept wiping the counter, calm and steady, her face unreadable. She didn't ask questions. She didn't go upstairs. She just swallowed the sting, the familiar burn she had known since she was a child. Aurora, the cook, walked in a few minutes later and paused when she saw Amelia's tight jaw. You heard something? Aurora asked quietly. Amelia shook her head, but her silence said everything. Aurora reached out and touched her arm. You don't let anything break you, you hear? That girl upstairs wearing diamond earrings. She has half your strength, if that. Remember who you are. But Amelia didn't fully know who she was anymore. She knew who she had to be. Quiet, efficient, invisible when needed. But sometimes she wondered if that invisibility was why people treated her like she wasn't real. Later that night, when she went to collect the laundry from Theo's room, she found an envelope on his desk with her name printed in bold, clean letters. Amelia Taylor, invited guest. For a second, the world blinked. She looked around the room, confused, unsure if she was being watched, unsure if it was a mistake. She opened it slowly and read the contents twice. She wasn't stupid. She understood the tone of the night upstairs. She knew it was a joke, a mockery, a way to embarrass her if she dared to take the invitation seriously. She placed the card back on the desk, walked out, closed the door gently, but her mind didn't let it go. That night, as she sat on the edge of her bed, the card kept replaying in her thoughts. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of making her a spectacle. She didn't want to walk into a room full of wealthy strangers and be mocked under bright lights. She didn't want embarrassment. She wanted dignity. But there was something else buried beneath all those fears. Something small, but sharp. A voice that said, "You deserve to be seen at least once. Not as a maid. As yourself." And for the first time in a long time, Amelia listened. The morning after Theo's careless invitation, the mansion felt heavier than usual. The Smith estate, usually humming with the predictable rhythm of opulence and quiet arrogance, seemed to hold its breath, as if it already knew that something unexpected was on the horizon. Amelia moved through the house like a shadow, unnoticed yet present, her routine perfectly precise. There was no dramatics, no sudden flair for attention. But something had changed, something subtle but undeniable. Amelia's transformation wasn't sudden. It was quiet, imperceptible at first, the kind that grows like water seeping through cracks in stone. She began waking earlier than usual, standing in front of her modest mirror with an intensity that made even the mirror pause. Her hair, once hastily tied in a bun, now fell in soft waves around her shoulders, catching the light in a way that made her own reflection hesitate. Her wardrobe, carefully selected for function and simplicity, began to take on a quiet elegance. Not extravagant, nothing that screamed wealth or attention, but enough to make her presence linger in a room long after she had passed through it. It started with small things. A touch of color on her lips, subtle yet striking. A necklace she found tucked in an old box, polished and shining against her collarbone. Even the way she held herself changed. Shoulders straightened, chin lifted, movements deliberate but fluid. Amelia was becoming aware, for the first time, that she didn't need anyone to notice her to exist. She existed, and that was enough. She began walking through the mansion with a new awareness, listening more intently to conversations, observing more carefully the interactions of the household. The staff, long used to her quiet compliance, began to notice the shift. Amelia no longer scurried away when someone looked at her. She returned gazes steadily, politely, with a hint of something unspoken. The gardeners, the cooks, even the maids who had teased her for years started to tiptoe around her presence. There was a power in silence that she had learned, and she wielded it without a word. Theo, meanwhile, remained oblivious. He strutted around the mansion with the same careless arrogance, laughing at his own jokes, congratulating himself for the fun invitation he had sent Amelia. He assumed everything would go exactly as he planned. Amelia would arrive, embarrassed and unnoticed, and everyone would share a discreet laugh at her expense. He didn't consider that Amelia was quietly changing, silently preparing for a moment that could neither be predicted nor controlled. Amelia's transformation extended beyond appearance. She became more attuned to her own mind, cataloging details she had once ignored. She noticed the nuances in Theo's tone, the subtle arrogance in Nicholas' comments, the genuine warmth in Isla's laughter. She began reading people not as obstacles or threats but as stories, each one predictable if observed closely. It was as if the invitation, though intended as a joke, had awakened something within her, a sense of agency, of self-possession. By the afternoon, her reflection had become almost startling to herself. Amelia paused in front of the mirror, studying the quiet strength in her eyes, the way light played across her cheekbones. She touched the fabric of her dress, a simple but well-cut piece she had borrowed from her limited wardrobe, and realized that for the first time, she liked what she saw. The girl who had once been overlooked, who had skulked through corridors to avoid attention, was evolving into someone who commanded presence without even trying. Even the way she spoke had shifted. There was a softness in her voice, yes, but also a firmness that made listeners lean in without realizing they were doing so. Conversations with her were no longer background noise. They became small, careful exchanges, punctuated by the quiet weight of intelligence and observation. Amelia had learned the power of restraint, the art of letting others underestimate her, while she quietly built herself into someone unforgettable. By the time evening approached, the transformation was nearly complete. Amelia could walk through the Smith mansion now and feel a sense of anticipation rather than anxiety. The joke invitation, Theo's careless plan, was no longer a threat. Instead, it was a promise, an opportunity to reveal, at the perfect moment, that she was no longer the quiet, unnoticed maid she had once been. She paused at the foot of the grand staircase, feeling the subtle thrill of change ripple through her. Tonight, she thought, everything would be different. And deep down, she knew she was ready. By the time evening settled over the Smith mansion, a quiet tension had begun to hum through the rooms, almost palpable. The staff who had witnessed Amelia's subtle transformation during the day were careful not to speak too loudly, yet their glances carried the weight of speculation. Even the air seemed to shift whenever she moved, a breeze of curiosity that no one could ignore. Whispers, soft and cautious, began to fill the corners of the mansion. In the drawing room, Mrs. Wilson, Theo's aunt and a longtime observer of the household's undercurrents, leaned slightly toward her niece-in-law and murmured, "Did you notice Amelia today? There's something different about her." Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial, but not quiet enough to avoid the ears of the nearby staff, who immediately paused mid-task. Isla, the younger of Theo's cousins, tilted her head, curious. "Different? How do you mean?" she asked, her tone cautious but tinged with excitement. The word different had a curious weight to it when applied to Amelia. It suggested a story, a shift, a revelation. I can't explain it," Mrs. Wilson continued, shaking her head. "She carries herself like she owns the place, yet she hasn't changed anything. It's subtle, but noticeable." Her eyes darted toward the staircase where Amelia had vanished moments earlier, the faint echo of her steps lingering in the polished marble. Across the mansion, in the kitchen, the staff exchanged their own low murmurs. "Did you see the way she held herself in the hall today?" whispered one cook, a middle-aged woman who had worked under the Smiths for over 20 years. "She's different. You can feel it when she walks past." "Different?" another staffer echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Amelia? That quiet, polite girl? Are you sure?" "I swear," the first replied, lowering her voice even further. "She's glowing. Not literally, but there's something in her now. Something that makes people look twice." Even Theo's usual confidants were starting to feel the ripple. In the study, he leaned back in his chair, unconcerned at first, confident that Amelia would arrive later as the punchline of his careless joke. But then Nicholas, his closest friend, raised an eyebrow and said casually, "Theo, have you noticed Amelia today? There's something different about her." Theo waved him off. "Different how? She's still Amelia. Quiet, polite. She'll be the same tonight. It's just wait and see." He didn't, however, meet Nicholas' steady gaze, which carried an unspoken question. Nicholas wasn't one to be easily impressed, yet even he had to admit, there was an undercurrent he couldn't name, a quiet power radiating from Amelia that hadn't been there before. Whispers became a quiet network of anticipation. In the hallways, servants and family members alike exchanged glances, cautious smiles, and subtle nudges. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that a quiet storm was approaching. Each whisper fed the next, like a carefully spun web of intrigue. Amelia's transformation had not gone unnoticed, and though she remained unaware of the magnitude of the attention she now commanded, the mansion was already abuzz. And yet, amidst all this quiet chatter, Amelia remained calm, moving through her preparation with deliberate care. She had learned, over the past day, the power of observation, of patience. She had watched, noted, and now understood the mansion and its inhabitants in a way she never had before. The whispers did not disturb her. If anything, they affirmed her own sense of quiet strength. By the time twilight began to stain the windows with its soft amber glow, the whispers had reached the drawing room, where Theo was pacing impatiently. "I don't see what's so special about her," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But his pacing slowed slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of a growing unease he couldn't yet name. He could feel it, the undercurrent, the subtle shift in attention toward Amelia. "Don't worry, Theo," Nicholas said calmly, though his tone carried an edge of warning. "She hasn't even arrived yet. But when she does, you might be surprised." Theo laughed, but it was nervous, brittle even. He was beginning, ever so slightly, to sense that his joke might not land the way he expected. The whispers had done their work, seeding curiosity, planting tension, and drawing eyes to a quiet, unexpected center of attention. Amelia, meanwhile, paused at her room's door, one hand lightly brushing against the frame. She felt it, the subtle energy, the awareness, the quiet anticipation. The whispers hadn't reached her directly, but she could feel their shadow, their impact. She knew, instinctively, that tonight would be different, that the world of the mansion she had navigated so carefully was about to shift. And for the first time, she didn't feel fear. Instead, she felt ready. Theo leaned against the grand staircase railing, a glass of champagne half forgotten in his hand. He had imagined the night perfectly. Amelia would arrive, sheepish and out of place, the perfect punchline to his careless joke. Laughter would ripple through the Smith mansion. His friends would commend his sense of humor, and Amelia would shrink into the background, quietly embarrassed. That was the plan. Except, as the evening progressed, every carefully laid expectation began to unravel. It started subtly. Guests arrived, dressed in understated elegance, sipping drinks and exchanging pleasantries. But as soon as Amelia stepped into the hallway, their conversations faltered. I shifted. Whispers paused mid-sentence. Even Theo's closest friends, Nicholas and Adam, exchanged subtle looks of disbelief. Theo's stomach sank. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Amelia's entrance had been deliberate, quiet but impossible to ignore. She didn't rush in, didn't make a grand announcement. She moved with an ease, a grace, that seemed entirely natural. Her dress, a soft shade of lavender, complemented her skin tone perfectly. Her hair framed her face with soft waves, and there was a calm confidence in her stride that Theo had never seen. Every calculated smirk, every glimmer of arrogance he had imagined, evaporated into something far more powerful. A presence that demanded attention without demanding it. Theo tried to mask his rising panic with a laugh, clinking his glass to call attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice carrying slightly too loudly, "I trust you all know Amelia, our delightful, quiet maid. I thought I'd invite her tonight, for fun." His words were meant to be teasing, ironic, but as he glanced at Amelia, he realized the irony was no longer his to control. She smiled politely, a simple gesture, and the room froze. Politeness had never held such weight before. Guests whispered, trying to discreetly comment without offending her. Theo's joke, the very thing he had counted on for amusement, had turned into the opposite of what he intended. Nicholas leaned slightly toward Theo, raising an eyebrow. "Funny joke," he said slowly, his voice low enough for only Theo to hear. "Except, everyone's looking at her, including me." Theo's laugh cracked, unsteady. "It's nothing," he muttered. Just wait. She'll." But Amelia didn't falter. She moved through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings, nods, and soft smiles. Every small interaction reinforced the unspoken truth. She wasn't embarrassed, she wasn't out of place, and most importantly, she wasn't the target of Theo's joke anymore. The joke, in fact, seemed to be on him. He could feel the shift. Guests who had once barely glanced at her now sought her attention, subtly trying to engage her in conversation. Whispers circulated faster, each more curious than the last. "Who is she really? She's stunning. She carries herself like she owns the place." Each whispered question, each envious glance, pushed Theo further into discomfort. Theo tried to salvage the situation, clinging to control like a lifeline. He introduced Amelia to a few acquaintances, hoping to position himself as the orchestrator of her presence, the master of the joke. But every introduction only reinforced the reality he couldn't escape. Amelia had stolen the attention, the admiration, the intrigue he had intended to be his. He stepped back, trying to analyze, to rationalize. It wasn't just her appearance. It was her confidence, her poise, the subtle way she navigated the room. She was luminous without trying, commanding without demanding. Guests who had arrived expecting a light-hearted evening now found themselves captivated. even inspired by a quiet, unexpected force. Theo's friends exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the shift. Adam shook his head slightly. "Theo, your joke," he said slowly. "It didn't land the way you thought." Theo forced a laugh, but it lacked conviction. He realized, with a sinking heart, that Amelia had flipped the narrative entirely. The maid, the subject of ridicule, had become the highlight of the evening. The one he intended to humiliate had become the center of admiration, subtle power radiating from her like a quiet storm. He glanced at Amelia, who now stood near the grand piano, conversing with a small group of guests. Her laughter was soft but genuine, captivating those around her. She made no effort to dominate the room, yet every eye was drawn to her. Theo's carefully planned joke had backfired spectacularly, and as the night stretched on, he realized something else, something far more troubling. He no longer wanted her to be embarrassed. He couldn't deny the magnetic pull she held, the undeniable shift in the balance of attention. Theo's joke had been meant to mock her, but Amelia had turned it into a stage, and he was left watching helplessly. By the time the first hour passed, the room was buzzing with whispers and curiosity, and Theo's forced laughter had all but disappeared. Amelia's quiet transformation had reached its full effect, and Theo was left facing the truth. His plan had utterly backfired. The grand doors of the Smith mansion opened with a deliberate creak, announcing the arrival of someone no one had expected to command attention so effortlessly. Amelia stepped through the threshold, and for a brief, suspended moment, the room seemed to pause. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, glasses of champagne wavered in midair, and every gaze in the room followed her as though pulled by an invisible force. She moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured, carrying herself with a quiet authority that belied her previous position. Tonight, Amelia was no longer the quiet, polite maid who had answered Theo's careless invitation with hesitant compliance. Tonight, she was something entirely different. A goddess in her own right, luminous without artifice, her presence commanding attention without a single word. The room, previously abuzz with polite social chatter, fell into a subtle hush. Theo, standing near the staircase, felt a jolt of unease run through him. He had thought he controlled the narrative. He had imagined Amelia's entrance as a punchline, a spectacle of awkward humility. But the truth was undeniable. As she crossed the threshold, every carefully laid expectation he had nurtured crumbled. She was captivating, undeniable, and utterly in control. Amelia's dress was simple yet elegant, a shade of deep emerald that complemented her complexion perfectly. It wasn't extravagance. It was subtle refinement that drew the eye and refused to let go. Her hair cascaded in soft waves, framing her face and catching the light in a way that seemed almost purposeful, though it was simply the result of her newfound confidence. Her makeup, minimal but expertly applied, enhanced her natural features rather than hiding them. Every detail had been considered, not for the applause of others, but for herself, and the room could sense it. As she moved further into the mansion, whispers began to circulate. Guests exchanged glances, their conversations dropping to low, cautious murmurs. "Who is she?" one guest whispered. "I've never seen her like this." Another added, "She's remarkable. There's something about her." Even the staff, who had long grown accustomed to the rhythms of the household, paused in their duties to watch. Amelia had transformed the familiar spaces of the mansion into a stage, and every footstep she took carried weight. The halls, once routine and predictable, seemed to shift in response to her presence. Theo, for the first time that evening, felt a flicker of fear. His plan, so meticulously crafted as a joke, had lost all control. Amelia's quiet confidence had turned the room, the guests, and even him against his intentions. He tried to laugh, attempting to reclaim a sense of dominance, but it rang hollow against the subtle hum of attention she now commanded. Nicholas, observing from across the room, allowed a small smile to creep onto his face. He had been skeptical of Amelia's impact, but now it was undeniable. He leaned toward Theo and said quietly, "I think your joke, failed spectacularly. Theo swallowed, unable to respond, as Amelia's eyes swept across the room. She acknowledged polite nods and soft greetings with gentle grace, but never with artificiality. She didn't need to dominate conversations. The room responded to her organically. Each smile, each gesture, each subtle glance drew attention without force, leaving a trail of fascination in her wake. Guests who had arrived expecting a light-hearted evening now found themselves captivated, enchanted, and slightly unnerved. They had anticipated spectacle, but Amelia offered presence. A quiet, powerful, undeniable presence that no one had prepared for. Even Isla and Aurora, Theo's cousins, exchanged astonished glances, their curiosity now mingled with admiration. Theo tried again to regain control, motioning toward Amelia and attempting a casual introduction to some guests. But it was futile. Amelia's aura was magnetic, and she did not need his assistance. The attention had shifted irreversibly. The narrative was no longer his to manage. As she paused near the center of the room, letting her gaze sweep over the gathering, Amelia felt a sense of clarity and empowerment she had never known. The joke that had been meant to humiliate her had, in truth, illuminated something within her. She had become the center of attention not through manipulation, not through spectacle, but through quiet transformation and undeniable self-possession. Theo, finally realizing the depth of his miscalculation, could only watch. His plan had backfired spectacularly, and in its place, Amelia had become a goddess at the entrance. A presence that would define the night, command the room, and leave every onlooker wondering how someone so quiet could hold such power. And for Amelia, the moment was intoxicating, not for vanity, not for revenge, but for the undeniable recognition that she was no longer invisible. She had arrived, not as a subject of mockery, but as the undeniable force at the heart of the evening, and the mansion would never feel the same again. The ballroom, with its towering crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, was alive with quiet anticipation even before Amelia entered. By now, whispers of her presence had spread through the mansion like wildfire, seeping into every corner. Guests who had arrived expecting an ordinary evening now found themselves alert, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Every pair of eyes seemed to instinctively follow the direction from which she would enter. And then Amelia appeared. It was not a dramatic entrance, nor a calculated display meant to command attention. It was simply her, walking with quiet confidence, every movement deliberate but fluid. Yet the effect was instantaneous. Conversations faltered mid-word. Laughter trailed off. Every gaze in the ballroom, whether noble, wealthy, or simply curious, shifted to her. The stares that filled the room were tangible, heavy with surprise, admiration, and unspoken questions. Theo felt at first the prickling awareness that his carefully constructed joke had completely reversed. Every eye was not only on Amelia. They were captivated, drawn involuntarily to the quiet force she had become. It was impossible to look away. He tried to laugh, to draw attention back to himself, but it sounded hollow against the steady, magnetic pull she emanated. The stares were not cruel. They were not mocking. They were filled with fascination, wonder, and a little envy. Even the most reserved guests could not hide their curiosity. Some whispered to one another, hesitant to speak too loudly, while others simply stared openly, unable to suppress their attention. Amelia's presence commanded it effortlessly. Amelia moved through the ballroom with the grace of someone fully aware of her own worth. Her smile was subtle, genuine, and disarming, acknowledging greetings without needing to dominate conversations. Her dress, a soft, flowing shade of emerald, swirled slightly with her movements, catching the candlelight in delicate flashes. Every detail, though unassuming, seemed to enhance the allure she projected naturally. Guests murmured quietly amongst themselves. "Who is she?" one asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen anyone like her in these circles." Another replied, "She carries herself with authority, but it's subtle, almost impossible to describe." Each whispered word added to the invisible weight she now held in the room, reinforcing her quiet command over attention. Theo's friends and family, who had once chuckled at his joke, now found themselves struggling to maintain composure. Nicholas shook his head slightly, a mix of amusement and admiration in his eyes. "Theo, you really didn't expect this, did you?" he said under his breath. Theo opened his mouth to respond but found no words sufficient. Amelia's entrance had rewritten the evening entirely. The stares were not just from strangers. Some were from people who had long underestimated her. Even the staff, accustomed to her quiet demeanor, now looked on with awe. Her quiet transformation had escalated into a presence that was impossible to ignore. Isla and Aurora, standing near the grand piano, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Both had been accustomed to the predictable rhythms of the mansion, the usual hierarchy and expected interactions. Yet here was Amelia, walking through a room of wealth and privilege, commanding attention without raising her voice, without demanding acknowledgement. It was astonishing. Amelia paused for a brief moment in the center of the ballroom, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. She noticed the stares, not with vanity, but with awareness. Each look, each whisper, each subtle reaction told her exactly what she needed to know. She had altered the perception of the room simply by being herself. Theo's discomfort grew as he watched her navigate effortlessly. Every attempt he made to redirect attention failed. The stares filled the ballroom, concentrated and persistent, reflecting not just admiration, but also a quiet recognition that Amelia was no longer someone to underestimate. By the time she approached the orchestra to accept a polite greeting, the room had shifted completely. Conversations picked up, but now they were shaped around her presence. Guests lingered near her, engaged in dialogue they might never have attempted before. The atmosphere was electric. Not with drama, but with fascination, with the subtle, undeniable allure that Amelia now carried. Theo realized then, with an uncomfortable clarity, that his plan had failed in every imaginable way. Amelia had turned the anticipated humiliation into a display of quiet power, capturing attention, respect, and curiosity in equal measure. The stares that filled the ballroom were a testament to her transformation. An invisible yet unyielding force no one, not even Theo, could ignore. And as Amelia moved gracefully through the crowd, acknowledging polite greetings without effort, it became clear to everyone present. Tonight, she was no longer the girl they had once overlooked. Tonight, she had claimed the room, not through spectacle, not through pretense, but simply by becoming exactly who she was meant to be. In the grand expanse of the ballroom, the murmurs had begun to settle into a soft hum, the kind that accompanies or rather than idle gossip. And it was in this quiet turbulence of attention that Isla and Aurora, Theo's cousins, finally allowed themselves to really observe Amelia. They had watched her from a distance earlier, curious but dismissive, assuming the novelty would fade once the initial shock wore off. Yet as Amelia moved through the room with a poised grace, they found themselves captivated, almost unwillingly, by her presence. It wasn't just her appearance. It was something deeper, something intangible that radiated from her every movement, every glance, every gentle smile. Isla, the younger of the two, tilted her head, trying to process the shift. "Aurora, do you see her?" she whispered, voice tight with disbelief. It's like, she owns the room." Aurora, older and usually more composed, didn't immediately answer. She simply watched Amelia glide past a group of guests, pausing briefly to exchange polite greetings. Every motion was deliberate, yet effortless, and every gesture seemed to draw attention naturally. It wasn't arrogance, far from it. It was presence, confidence, command. And both Isla and Aurora felt a strange, unfamiliar pull. "She's stunning," Aurora finally admitted, voice quiet but undeniable. "Not just in looks. It's how she carries herself. There's something about her I can't quite place." Isla nodded slowly, her eyes following Amelia as she approached a small cluster of guests near the grand staircase. "It's not just that," she said thoughtfully. "It's how she makes everyone notice her without even trying. I've never seen anything like it in this house, or in anyone I know." The cousins exchanged a glance, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and a hint of unease. They had grown up navigating the predictable social dynamics of wealth and influence, accustomed to the hierarchy and the subtle power plays of the mansion. Yet here was Amelia, a maid, effortlessly bypassing all their assumptions, silently demanding attention in a way that no one had expected. Amelia, completely unaware of the intense scrutiny from the two young women, continued her path through the room. She paused only briefly to acknowledge greetings, her subtle nods and gentle smiles leaving lasting impressions on those she encountered. Every eye followed her, every whisper carried her name, and the energy she exuded seemed to ripple outward, affecting even those who tried not to notice. Isla leaned closer to Aurora, whispering again, "Do you think Theo expected this?" Aurora shook her head slowly. "No, there's no way. He thought this would be a joke. And yet, look at her. She's transformed the entire room. She's unstoppable." The two cousins watched as guests gravitated toward Amelia, drawn by her presence in a way that was impossible to resist. She was polite, engaging, and approachable, yet the simple act of existing in the space commanded respect and fascination. They realized, almost simultaneously, that they had underestimated her entirely. The quiet girl they had known or thought they knew was gone. In her place stood someone they could neither predict nor ignore. Amelia's attention never lingered unnecessarily, never sought approval. And that, perhaps more than anything, made her magnetic. Isla and Aurora recognized it immediately. This was not performance. This was authenticity. Every detail, every gesture, every glance carried weight because it came from someone fully aware of her own presence. Even the subtle power dynamics of the Smith mansion seemed to shift in her wake. Guests who had arrived expecting the usual hierarchy of status and influence found themselves recalibrating unconsciously. Who commanded attention now? Clearly, it wasn't Theo, nor Nicholas, nor anyone else accustomed to the unspoken rules of the household. Amelia had claimed the room, and Isla and Aurora, like everyone else, could not help but notice. The cousins exchanged one final, silent look. It was a look of acknowledgement, of understanding, and perhaps even of reluctant admiration. Amelia had done something none of them had anticipated. She had taken a space where she was expected to be invisible and transformed it into a stage where her presence was undeniable. And as Amelia continued to move gracefully through the room, Isla and Aurora felt a quiet shift within themselves, a realization that she was more than just a maid, more than just a surprise in the night. She was a force, a presence, and from this moment forward, she could no longer be ignored. Nicholas had always been the observant one, the quiet force behind the Smith mansion's social theater. While Theo relied on charm and brash confidence, Nicholas watched, catalogued, and understood the subtle movements of those around him. And tonight, as he leaned against the balcony railing overlooking the ballroom, he couldn't help but notice the way every gaze, every whisper, and every hesitant smile seemed to converge on Amelia. He had seen her earlier, of course, but this was different. Tonight, she had evolved into something unmistakable, an unspoken magnetism that went beyond beauty, beyond grace. There was depth in her presence, a quiet authority that no one could challenge, a command of space and attention that was both natural and unyielding. Nicholas's eyes followed her as she moved through the crowd, exchanging polite words with guests, nodding gracefully, laughing softly at their jokes without overshadowing them. Each movement was deliberate yet effortless. Each glance held a subtle acknowledgement of the room without demanding its submission. She was not performing. She was simply being herself, and the effect was extraordinary. It struck Nicholas suddenly, sharply, with a clarity that left him momentarily speechless. Theo's plan had failed, spectacularly. The joke he had intended to humiliate Amelia had transformed into something entirely different. She had not only survived the potential embarrassment, she had thrived, capturing attention, admiration, and curiosity from every corner of the room. Nicholas's mind raced. He considered the magnitude of what had occurred. Amelia had quietly transformed herself over the past day. He had observed the subtle hints of change earlier, the confidence that had begun to appear in her posture, the awareness in her gaze, the deliberate care in her movements. But seeing her now in the ballroom, commanding attention naturally, he understood the full truth. She had become more than a maid. She had become someone who could hold the room without a word, someone who could shift perception effortlessly, someone who had been underestimated entirely. He glanced toward Theo, whose forced laughter and nervous gestures betrayed the panic Nicholas had suspected. The room no longer belonged to Theo. It belonged to Amelia. Nicholas felt a quiet, private admiration grow within him, accompanied by an undeniable respect. He had always been measured, cautious, strategic, but even he could not ignore the raw, unspoken force Amelia now embodied. Nicholas realized, with a mixture of awe and quiet satisfaction, that Amelia's rise had not been accidental. She had prepared herself subtly, observed carefully, and stepped into the space tonight fully aware of her potential. This wasn't luck. This was skill. This was quiet mastery of presence, a gift that few could recognize or cultivate. He watched as guests lingered near her, drawn not by spectacle or extravagance but by the natural magnetism she radiated. Even the staff, accustomed to predictability and routine, were captivated, whispering among themselves and stealing glances. Nicholas understood, fully and finally, that Amelia had rewritten the dynamics of the mansion. She had claimed authority, not by force, but by being fully herself, a presence impossible to ignore. Nicholas felt a shift in his own perception. He had always valued intelligence, poise, and subtle power, and now he realized that Amelia possessed all of these in abundance. She was someone who could challenge assumptions, who could disrupt hierarchy, who could make those who underestimated her reconsider everything they thought they knew. The realization hit deeper when he noticed her briefly glance toward the balcony. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and he saw the quiet confidence in her gaze. She wasn't seeking recognition, and yet she commanded it. Nicholas felt a rare mixture of admiration and humility. He understood that he was witnessing the emergence of someone extraordinary, someone who would not only survive scrutiny but thrive under it. In that instant, Nicholas resolved something quietly to himself. He would no longer underestimate Amelia. He would not view her as a mere maid or a footnote in Theo's reckless plan. He now understood the truth. She was formidable, intelligent, and fully capable of shaping the room, and anyone in it, without demanding their attention. Nicholas leaned back slightly, a small, private smile tugging at his lips. The truth was clear, undeniable, and transformative. Amelia had become the center of the evening, the force around which everything now revolved, and Nicholas was among the first to truly see it. The room continued to hum with fascination, but Nicholas's attention was singular. He now saw what everyone else was beginning to realize. This was no longer a joke, and no one, not Theo, not the guests, not even the staff, would ever look at Amelia the same way again. The night had reached its peak, and the Smith mansion had transformed from a house of casual socializing into a stage for subtle, unspoken drama. Amelia, moving with quiet confidence through the crowd, had become the undeniable center of attention. Each gesture, each smile, each polite nod rippled across the room, drawing whispers, glances, and lingering stares that Theo could no longer control. Theo's earlier amusement had faded completely, replaced by a creeping tension he couldn't shake. His plan, meant to humiliate Amelia for the sake of a joke, had spiraled out of his control. Guests now looked at her with a mixture of admiration and awe. Conversations that had once flowed around the evening's usual trifles now revolved, consciously or unconsciously, around Amelia. She had claimed the room without raising her voice, without demanding attention, without a single ounce of theatrics. Amelia was aware of the effect she had on the room, but she did not exploit it. She navigated the space with the same poise and grace she had cultivated in private moments, acknowledging polite greetings, offering small smiles, and engaging in brief exchanges. Every action was subtle, deliberate, and powerful. Yet the result was undeniable. She had stolen the night. Guests who had once been confident in their social standing now found themselves leaning in to catch her words, adjusting their posture to match the quiet confidence she exuded. Even Nicholas, who had earlier recognized her transformation, felt a sense of awe at how naturally she commanded presence. It was not just her beauty that captivated. It was her awareness, her subtle power, her ability to exist fully and unapologetically in a space where she had once been invisible. Isla and Aurora, observing from across the room, exchanged glances that said more than words could convey. They had noticed the shift from the moment Amelia entered, but now it had reached a level they could no longer ignore. The quiet maid they had known, or thought they had known, was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself like she belonged to the room in a way no one else could challenge. Amelia paused near the grand piano, the soft light catching the emerald of her dress. A small group of guests surrounded her, engaged in conversation, hanging on her words. She laughed softly at a light-hearted remark, and the room seemed to inhale. Every eye remained drawn to her. The air had changed. It was no longer just a gathering. It was a performance shaped entirely by her presence, and she was unaware of the full magnitude of her impact. Theo, standing awkwardly near the staircase, felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His joke had backfired completely. What he had intended to be a moment of mockery had become a testament to Amelia's quiet power. Every failed attempt to redirect attention, every nervous gesture, reminded him of just how fully she had captured the room. He tried once more to regain composure, motioning for a toast, hoping to create a distraction. "Everyone," he called, forcing a casual tone. "Let's celebrate." His voice faltered as he saw that no one turned to him. They were all watching Amelia. Even the staff paused mid-task, enchanted by her subtle command. Amelia accepted the subtle attention with grace. She did not seek it, she did not flaunt it, and yet she possessed it fully. By simply being herself, she had claimed not only the focus of the room but also the unspoken respect of every guest. She had stolen the night from the very people who had underestimated her, turning what was meant as a humiliating joke into a triumph of quiet power. As the evening drew on, whispers continued to circulate. "Who is she? She's unlike anyone I've ever met. I've never seen her before, but I can't stop looking at her." Each murmur reinforced the reality of the transformation. Amelia had taken control of the night effortlessly. Even Theo had to admit, internally, silently, that she had won. Not through spectacle, not through manipulation, but through quiet self-possession. The maid he had invited as a joke had become the undeniable highlight of the evening, eclipsing every expectation, every plan, every assumption. As the night moved toward its quiet conclusion, Amelia stood near the center of the room, catching her breath after a series of polite interactions. She looked around and felt a strange, satisfying sense of accomplishment. Not from vanity, not from pride, but from knowing she had navigated the room on her terms. The guests were captivated. The whispers continued, and Theo's smirk had disappeared entirely. Amelia had done something that few could claim to achieve. She had transformed an ordinary evening into a moment where her presence alone defined the energy of the room. She had stolen the night, not with arrogance, not with force, but with the undeniable power of simply being herself. And in that stolen moment, she realized something profound. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer underestimated. Tonight, she had claimed the night, and in doing so, she had changed everything for everyone present. The night had settled into a quiet rhythm, the earlier tension in the Smith mansion giving way to subdued conversations and the soft clinking of glasses. Yet, for Theo, the weight of the evening pressed down heavier than ever. His carefully constructed joke, the invitation meant to mock Amelia, had completely unraveled, leaving his reputation and sense of control in tatters. From the moment Amelia entered the ballroom, everything he had planned had slipped beyond his grasp. The stares that followed her, the whispers of fascination, the subtle admiration of guests who had once laughed at his antics. It had all combined into a reality he could neither deny nor control. Theo had imagined amusement, validation, and attention. Instead, he had received a mirror reflecting his own arrogance and misjudgment. Guests who had once regarded him with casual respect now exchanged glances that carried unspoken commentary. Theo could see the subtle shifts in demeanor, the quiet recalibrations of social perception. Where he had expected authority and charm to dominate, he found himself invisible in comparison to Amelia's quiet power. His position as the orchestrator of the evening had been usurped, not by someone louder, flashier, or more cunning, but by a girl he had assumed was inconsequential. Nicholas, who had observed the night with growing fascination, caught Theo's eye and shook his head slightly. There was no malice in the gesture, only recognition. The joke had backfired. Theo's pride had been shattered, not through ridicule, but through the undeniable presence of Amelia, who had quietly claimed control of the room. Even Isla and Aurora, who had watched in awe from the sidelines, had begun to approach the realization that their assumptions about hierarchy, influence, and visibility were no longer valid. The quiet maid who had once moved through the mansion unnoticed had now become the focus of admiration and intrigue. And as Theo observed this, he felt the sting of his own irrelevance for the first time in years. Amelia herself remained unaware of the full impact of her presence. She navigated the room with grace, acknowledging greetings, offering polite smiles, and engaging in conversation without ever seeking attention. And yet, with every interaction, she rewrote the unspoken social order. The whispers that followed her, the subtle shifts in the posture of the wealthy and powerful, the quiet recalibration of expectations, none of it was deliberate performance. It was simply the effect of being seen for who she truly was. Theo tried one last effort to salvage his evening, attempting a toast that would redirect focus to himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice forcing cheer, "let us raise our glasses." But the room did not respond to him. Every gaze remained fixed on Amelia. Every whispered comment, every small gesture, every lingering glance was directed toward her. Theo faltered, realizing that his attempt to reclaim control was futile. The room had chosen her. His plan had failed utterly. And in that moment, Theo's reputation, careless, cocky, and overconfident, was laid bare. Those who had once deferred to him now understood that he had misjudged the situation entirely. The joke he had thought would amuse and elevate him had instead revealed a flaw in his character. Underestimation, arrogance, and an inability to recognize true presence when it appeared. Amelia, moving toward the grand piano for a brief pause, remained serene. She was unaware of the ripple effect she had caused, unaware of the subtle dismantling of Theo's social dominance, unaware that her quiet grace had left the guests reevaluating everything they thought they knew. She simply existed in her own space, radiant and composed, commanding attention not through spectacle but through authenticity. As the night drew toward its close, Theo could no longer pretend that the evening had gone as planned. His carefully curated image had been disrupted, his authority undermined, and his confidence shaken. Amelia had done what no one had expected. She had taken a room full of wealthy, entitled individuals and held them captive with nothing more than her presence. In that quiet realization, Theo felt the full weight of what had occurred. His joke had not only failed, it had exposed his own arrogance and misjudgment. And yet, despite the humiliation, he could not help but feel a grudging respect for Amelia. She had shattered expectations, reshaped the night, and claimed a reputation that was entirely her own. The whispers that had followed her through the evening now settled into a hum of acknowledgement. Everyone present understood that something extraordinary had occurred. Amelia had arrived as a quiet, unassuming maid, but she would leave the night having altered perceptions, reshaped hierarchies, and claimed attention in a way that no one, not even Theo, could challenge. By the time the last guests had departed, the mansion had changed. Theo's reputation had been shattered, not through ridicule or scandal, but through the undeniable force of Amelia's presence. And for Amelia, the night had been a revelation. A confirmation that quiet strength, subtle confidence, and authenticity could command respect, admiration, and even awe in a world that had expected her to remain invisible. She had stolen the night, and in doing so, she had changed everything for everyone, including Theo, who would never underestimate her again.